Hi folks, I'm Laird Landon. In this segment and the one that follows it, I'm going to be talking directly to professional caregivers. Those of you that have watched the other segments that are family caregivers, you might find some interest in it too. Our traditional healthcare system is broken. It does not serve family caregivers well. Professionals are not trained in caring for the families. They aren't paid for caring for the families. And they don't really know what the families are going through. I'd like to read you a quote to let you know how some caregivers feel about the healthcare system. A last-ditch treatment for relapsed cancer showed me just how broken our system is. When my husband was discharged, he was immunocompromised, blind, too weak to walk unassisted, and unable to eat more than half his calories. The oncologist said, he'll need attendance 24 hours a day. I stared at him in panic. How am I supposed to do that? We have 2 kids. Even meeting our family's most basic needs would be impossible. The doctor replied, well, the family steps in and everything works out fine. He said that as he was waving away his hand. Folks, this is not an old story. This quote came from the New York Times in March of 2021. In this segment, I'd like to describe to professionals what caregivers go through. In the next segment, which will appear right after this one, we'll talk about what professionals can do to better help family caregivers. In a following segment after this, I'm going to talk about the palliative health care model, which is the new way to treat families and the entire patient. We'll discuss how that works and why it will be better for caregivers. A wise neurologist once told me, when I make a diagnosis of a neurological disease, I realize I have 2 patients. My patient and the caregiver. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could all follow that advice? The primary thing to keep in mind always about family caregivers of neurological diseases is that they are caregivers for a very long time. They spend more time caring for their loved one than all professionals put together. And this long time is filled with grief. The 36-hour day, the book, described this as the long goodbye. And it is both things. It is very long and it is goodbye. Imagine watching someone you love very much fade away slowly and lose the person that they were. Caregiver burden is the stress that results from this. It's physical, emotional, and behavioral. Physically, you gain weight, your blood pressure goes up, blood sugar increases as well because of cortisol being released into the body. Behaviorally, people react more alcohol consumption and very poor sleep. Emotionally, it is anxiety about what is going to happen next. It is self-doubt. It is social isolation. And most important, it is depression. 1/3 to 1/2 of all caregivers suffer periods of depression. It's very important to keep in mind this depression is caused by the situation they're in. It is not caused by an imbalance in the body or some other process. The second term I want to discuss is caregiver burnout. This is an extreme stage of caregiver burden in which the individual loses the ability to act properly. They become negligent. They have no motivation to do anything. They're stuck in the chair. This, of course, can lead to bad outcomes for the patient. The caregiver can neglect the patient, and even in extreme cases, abuse the patient. Physical abuse occurs, it's more negligence. The one kind of abuse that I see that often no one else notices is financial abuse. The caregiver takes over the bank account. The caregiver is the one responsible. And as they give up, as they lose their perspective, they think they can tap into the money for themselves. They think maybe they're going to get the money anyway after mom dies. So caregiver burnout is something to watch for if you're a professional. Any kind of apathy is a real concern and should be followed up. The second most important thing to consider about caregivers when you're working with them is that this experience is filled with grief. We aren't very good at that in Western civilization because we think grief is only associated with death. As a matter of fact, I'm going to talk a little bit later that until 1950, until Kubler-Ross in the 60s, very few Americans even expected grief to be the case for somebody who's alive. But the truth is, most of us experience grief throughout our lifetimes. I remember being 9. I had a pet dog, a Cocker Spaniel named Sam. He was black. He had white chest, white boots. I was 9 years old, and he had to be put down. I ran from the dinner table, went into my room, cried my eyes out, didn't want to come out, didn't want to do anything. Finally, I had to do something, so I got up and I carried on, and pretty soon I dealt with it. I was grieving, but you know what? No one in my family used the word grief. I'll bet you can think of experiences that happened when you were very young that were grieving moments, but they weren't labeled as grief. There are two kinds of grief I really want to get into because they're often misunderstood or used inappropriately. The first is ambiguous grief. The second is anticipatory grief. Ambiguous grief is grief that was first described in 1999 by Pauline Boss. She studied family members of prisoners of war who weren't coming back. She identified those people as having ambiguous grief because the person that they cared about was physically not present, but they were emotionally present. She identified a second kind of ambiguous grief that is appropriate for family caregivers. You can reverse those two clauses. Family caregivers are dealing with a situation in which the person is alive. They're standing right in front of them. But they're slowly going away. Every time there is a significant episode for the caregiver, when they find their person isn't the way they used to be, they grieve. It's interesting. Caregivers want to remember. They want them to be the way they were. And every time they lose a function, they get lost driving, they forget a name, they can't cook a favorite meal. The caregiver takes that as a strong cue. They are leaving and they grieve. The second type of grief that caregivers feel is anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is when a person thinks about, it is very real, the death of the loved one. It is not like ambiguous grief. It certainly doesn't happen all the way along. When mom gets lost driving, I do grieve, but I'm not grieving for her death, because for me as a caregiver, that grief, that death is a long way into the future. There are times, however, where caregivers do grieve in an anticipatory way before death. One good example is a diagnosis. I know I had the strongest grief response from the diagnosis of my wife than any other period in the process, even, if you can imagine this, more than her death. Her death was impending for a long time. So diagnosis is a time to be very careful about giving the patient and the family too much information. We'll talk about that in a moment. A second time when it can occur is during placement. When you finally transfer, if you do, your loved one to a memory care unit or to hospice. It is kind of a milestone that you're no longer the primary caregiver. Someone else is providing for their daily care. You're not out of the picture, we'll discuss that, but it is a moment where you separate what was from what will be, and you may even anticipate the death. In the case of hospice, you must agree not to try curative measures. You must agree that death is likely within the next 6 months. Active dying, of course, towards the end is another time. Many of us as caregivers don't really know when it's going to happen. Yes, they're declining, but we don't know. Nobody can predict it. But when the nurse calls and says, I see signs of active dying, you know there are only a few days left, and it triggers thoughts of death. The thing that is really interesting about Lindemann's work is he was a psychiatrist, and he didn't study family caregivers. He didn't even study people after death. He studied during the Second World War wives of men who were overseas that they imagined might not come home. And Kubler-Ross in the 60s, in her groundbreaking work, also didn't study people who were grieving a death. She was studying people who were in hospice who were about to die. I think it's pretty clear from what I've said, grief is very different before and after, and those people just before death are dealing with anticipatory grief, but it is improper to use that term for all the grief that caregivers feel. A few words on how you as a professional can help caregivers with their grief. The most important is to try to recognize that they are grieving, because they probably don't. If they appear listless, if they appear discouraged, even if they're angry that they don't think their loved one is working or trying hard enough, they might be grieving. In support groups, when we hear this kind of behavior, someone in the group will often say, "Oh, sounds like you're grieving." And the person says, "What? I'm not grieving. I'm just angry." They are grieving, and when they think about it, they'll recognize it. Help them recognize that grief is involved in the process. Another thing that's very useful is to try to encourage them to think about blaming the disease, not blaming themselves because they can't keep this disease from progressing. Also, you don't want them to blame their loved one because they're not trying hard enough. They just sit and watch TV all day. I can't get them up. They won't do it. Guess what? They probably aren't able to do it. You can't fix them. And if you blame the disease, it's a little easier to accept. Finally, we find that caregivers sometimes, when they're grieving, blame other family members for not helping them enough. Maybe the other families can't help. They're 500 miles away. They have children of their own. There are many reasons why not everybody can be there with you all the time. The value of blaming the disease is it takes the responsibility off of the caregiver. If they aren't responsible, what would they do instead of trying to fix them? They would try to make them comfortable and create moments of joy. This is the heart of what caregivers need to do. Not try to make them exercise, but to make them comfortable and find things that bring life to them. In a word, this is palliative care. Also talk to them about positive experiences. Yes, today there's a particular crisis, but in the last month or so, is there anything that's been good? Is there any ways you've made them smile? And they will retell some success stories, and that will help them connect that they aren't failing, they aren't losing.